So, folks, I've just sat down here after looking at a whole bunch of different portfolios from photographers. And what I want to talk about today is the subject of consistency. Now, this is a very broad subject, and there's many different touch points that we can address when it comes to consistency. And I look back at my own portfolio and I realized that my actual portfolio that I presented to clients back in 2013 was also very inconsistent. And the thing is, when you're starting out, you don't really know where you're going. You're testing the waters, you're testing the different editing styles, you're testing the different camera gear, you're testing the different lenses, and you haven't really got any kind of vision or focus or drive to where you're going. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you my portfolio, okay? As you can see, we've got a whole different vibe going on there. It's very different to what my work looks like now, and you can probably tell straight away that this is all over the place. You've got black and white, you've got color, we've got the grungy effects, we've got the light and airy, we've got dark and moody. And that was one of the things that I actually presented to people because I wanted to please everybody. I wanted to make sure that I covered off the folks that loved the black and white portfolios. I wanted to make sure that I satisfied the folks who loved the light and airy or the dark and moody. And I didn't have any cohesive look to my images. And if I look at my portfolio now, what's actually happening now is that many folks are approaching me and telling me, Dan, I saw your image in this group the other day, and before I actually saw your name, I said to myself, that's Daniel's work. And this is where we really want to drive ourselves as visual artists to. We want to have a particular identity in this industry. And this all comes from doing things in a logical way, in a consistent way. And like I said, there's different touch points when it comes to consistency. And today, what I want to do is actually take you through one of my shoots, and I want to show you how I build upon a consistent edit workflow. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to head on over to Lightroom in a moment, and I'm going to show you all the steps that I deploy inside of Lightroom to get that initial consistent editing phase. And then I'm going to take an image from that gallery and put it into Photoshop. And I'm going to show you exactly how I sort of look at my image and how I develop a strategy or a workflow. Because if you haven't got an editing workflow that checks off certain things, you're going to land up with inconsistent edits. And you know what? I actually just thought about this now. When I started out, I was offering clients up to 40 or 50 images from a shoot, and I'd edit through all of those images. And I remember the one time so vividly, it's kind of weird. I remember I was editing this gallery and I'd gone through 10 images with a certain edit style to it. And I just sat back on my workstation and I thought, you know what? I actually don't like this edit anymore. What I'm going to do is have a cup of coffee, come back in a couple of minutes and reevaluate what I've done. And I had that cup of coffee, I went back to the workstation and I started off editing completely differently. Okay. And the issue is because I started at a different point. I looked at something else in the workflow. I was looking at something like the color profile, and then I went down to something else in the workflow, and it completely changed my trajectory in terms of the end result. So by the time I edited this gallery of 40 or 50 images, the edit was like this. It was all over the place, and it was frustrating to look at in the end. And what I'm hoping to do with this video today is touch on those key fundamentals to achieving a consistent edit workflow. All right. I'll also touch on some of the things that I do at camera level to inspire that initial consistency. We'll dive into that as well. But for now, let's jump on over to Lightroom, and I'm going to demonstrate some of the things that I use in my workflow to achieve a consistent workflow. So let's go and have a look. We're now inside of Lightroom, and before we get into the fundamental steps of creating a consistent edit workflow, what I want us to do is just rewind the time and actually talk about creating consistency at camera level. Now, I'm not going to dive deep into the subject because it'll just simply open up a can of worms, and we don't want that right now. I want us to focus on getting consistent editing results. Now, consistency for me starts at the camera level by shooting in good light, picking our locations that give us consistently beautiful light, using the lenses that appeal to our desired vision, and then of course setting up our camera according to the light patterns that we're shooting in, choosing the right white balance, choosing the right exposure settings, and dialing in those consistent results right at the camera level. Now let's have a look at that very, very quickly. We're shooting here with the Sony A9, and I've got my settings at 1/320th of a second at f1.8 with an ISO of 320. For this particular portrait series, I'm shooting with a 135mm f1.8 Sigma Art lens. Now, I walked into this location and I said, Susan, let's just put you in this position, and I'm going to take that initial shot so I can understand and I can dial in the right settings. So I would take that quick test shot and then move on. If I'm happy with the exposure, then I'll start rocking. I'll start shooting and we'll start getting into action and we'll get the game flowing. Now, let's move on to this image over here. You can see that we had the same settings. What happened then is that I asked Susan to move forward in the location just a tiny little bit from out underneath the trees. And the minute she'd done that, she stepped out into stronger light. And what I had to do then is actually shoot with a slightly faster shutter speed. Now you'll notice that all the images thereafter are shot at the same settings. Every one of them, all the way up to these ones here, where I dialed in closer to her, all shot with the same settings because I'm picking a location that's going to give me consistent results. Now let's just go back to this image over here. And what we'll do is we'll look at the editing workflow. Very first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that I actually love the way that Adobe have laid out these panels in Lightroom because it actually helps us queue up that consistent edit workflow. Let's start from the top. We have our color profile right here. Now, I happen to like the Adobe Color Profile because it works well with the cameras that I shoot with. My Sony A9, my Leica SL2, my Nikon D750. The only camera that I've ever had an issue with the Adobe Color Profile is with the Canon R5, which I've had to make a custom profile for because I simply just didn't like what Adobe was doing with the Canon files. Anyway, that's a topic for another discussion. So I happen to like the Adobe Color Profile, and that sets you up for that initial translation of colors, you could call it. It gives us that base color. So if we go and change these, you see here, Adobe Portrait, Standard, they all give you slightly different results. Vivid, that's just too much for me. You need to make a calculated decision today as to what you want to set that to. It's no good having all of these different color profiles as a baseline because it's going to destroy any sense of a consistent workflow. So dial this in, make a decision today and stick with it because we are working towards a consistent workflow. So that's what I've done. I like using the Adobe Color Profile. There we go. Next up, very important. This is the basis of where all our things color happen. All right, white balance. We have set ourselves to cloudy here because of the light conditions that we were shooting in. And this is something else that I like to control at camera level. Because why? Because it creates consistency inside of my editing. So all of these images you see here, we've got identical white balance settings. It's not auto white balance that often makes things look a little bit blue or makes people look a little bit, I would say, pale. That's not what we got here. All of these images have got identical white balance settings. Why? Consistency. It's absolute key for me personally. So this is locked in. If I have to make any kind of changes to it, I can, but we'll get to that. So below that, we've got all of the common or basic editing tools here. So exposure, for example, contrast. Now I'm going to move these sliders just a tiny little bit to my liking because of how I've got this set up. I'm going to reduce the whites, maybe bump up the blacks over here. This is what I'm looking for in this particular image. We then go down to the presence sliders. Now remember, this is what's working for me. You might want to tune your images differently, but we're going to get to this. As we go down, I rarely even touch the tone curve. Sometimes I'll touch the mixer. You'll see this when you dive into the classes that I'm offering. You'll see my full edit workflow where I might adjust these settings. In this case here, I don't need to do anything. Okay, maybe we will. Let's do this. We're going to go to our luminance colors here, and I'm going to drop the greens there to make them a little bit more darker. Or maybe let's increase the saturation of the greens. There we go. And we could maybe even play with a hue of those greens. There we go. I like a deeper green. Let's leave those settings there. From there on, you've got your sharpening. I don't need to do any sharpening to this particular image. So we'll move along. And then you'll get your lens corrections. I usually turn on my remove chromatic aberration because sometimes with people like me who shoot wide apertures, sometimes we've got a lot of highlighted areas against very dark areas. You might have what we call purple fringing, in other words, chromatic aberration, or it might be green. Below that, we've got enable profile corrections. This is something that I sometimes turn on based on the lenses that I'm using. In this case here, I happen to actually like the natural vignette that this lens displays at f1.8 because it keeps the viewer's eye centralized in this frame. So we can go all the way down here and make these appropriate settings, and they're all in logical order. So that moves us on to the next step here into creating a consistent workflow. So we made these adjustments to this particular image, but we've got all of these images in the same series. So how do I import, or how do I copy all of this edited information across these other images? Very, very simple. All I need to do is click on my next image, hold down Shift, and whilst holding down Shift, scroll to the last image in that particular set. You'll notice that I didn't say these images over here, but I'm talking about this particular set. Why? Because they all shot in the same location at the same angle with the same settings. And all we do here is whilst holding the Shift key down, we click on previous. We click it once and you'll notice that previous settings were updated for 8 images. So from image 127 all the way through to 135, we have identical settings. There we go. So if I had to send all of these images, these 8 images to Susan, for example, and she came back to me and said, Dan, can you give me 128? And I like number 133. I could take these images into Photoshop with an image basis that's identical. So what am I saying here? So if I edit this image and I edit this image inside of Photoshop, my starting results in both images are identical. And that leads us on to the next step of where the consistency happens. So let's do that now. I'm going to choose this image over here and I'm going to open it inside of Photoshop. So one of the things that I like to do is create a methodical way or a methodical approach to how I evaluate these images inside of Photoshop, because that's going to be key to the consistent results or the way I edit. Now, in the beginning, I would start off with so many different steps. I'd look at so many different things instead of actually putting things into little compartments in my mind and how I'm going to edit. Now, we've started off with a consistent edit in Lightroom. We haven't changed anything. I'm starting off with the same results. Now, what I do is I look at my images, and you'll notice this when I talk about it inside of the editing tutorials. I start off with looking at my image. I evaluate everything in my image, so I break it down into this consistent workflow. So the very first thing that I'm trying to evaluate in my image is, where are my distracting objects? I'll look up over here and I'll say, we got them over there. Let's do this quickly. I'm going to just create a blank layer. You guys don't have to do this. I just want to demonstrate what I'm looking at here. So I'm going to evaluate my image based on the distracting elements. And just for the purpose of our tutorial today, I'm just going to make this red over here, and we'll just highlight those areas there. 1, 2, there's a little distracting area there. And we've got some distracting spots over here. And maybe I don't like those branches hanging out. And one of the things that I often say in the classes is that the devil's in the details. Now, maybe we could do something about this area here, but on the dress over here, we've got a little issue there where the white petticoat was sticking out. We've got a couple of little areas here where the grass isn't conforming to what I want. I know that's pedantic, but like I said, the devil's in the details. And then I'll highlight and I'll scan across my image looking at distracting objects. Okay, let's go and say DO, distracting objects. Then I will look at my image and I'll say to myself, what can I see in terms of color distractions? So I will evaluate the image based on color distractions, CD in this case. Color distractions. I'm evaluating my image and I'm saying to myself, you know what? I don't really see any color distractions. Let's say, for example, I'd shot Susan on this road and it was a big blue bus in the background, or something that had a color that's not conforming to the rest of our color that we're looking for in our image. I would get rid of that. I'm trying to create color harmony. This is something else that I cover in the classes. I talk about color harmony and creating color harmony. And as one would do, when you're looking at color harmony, you're going to try to get rid of all of the elements that don't gel well with the rest of the colors in the image. So I'm going to scan across my image and look for the color distractions. From that point on, I will then evaluate the subject itself. In this case here, the subject, Susan. And what I will do is that I'll look at the clothing. I'll say to myself, is there anything that we need to correct in terms of the clothing? Is there anything that I need to do in terms of correcting skin tones? This is usually a big yes. Okay, what am I going to do about the skin tones? I will then look at the reds in the skin and I'll look at the yellows of the skin. So let's do that. We'll get rid of what we've got here, okay? And we'll pretend that we've actually dealt with those distracting objects and distracting colors. In fact, I'm going to leave it there. Let's just work on Susan's skin tones. So remember, we looked at our frame for distracting objects. Then we broke it down to distracting colors. From that, let's say hypothetically that I actually did work on those elements. I would then move over to the subject. I would analyze the subject for any issues. So the skin tones. I would look at the skin tones and then I would adjust the skin tones accordingly. I'd break it down into the two primary colors that might make up our skin tones in our subject. In this case, yellow, and the other one is red. So I'd click on the yellow and I'd ramp it all the way to the top here to get me a visual reference of where the yellows are. And then I'd shift this little color bar over in my hue and saturation adjustment layer until I can find out where those yellows are in Susan's skin. This is what we're doing here. I'll then invert that mask, and I would simply take my brush and brush it over her skin. I'd obviously make sure that this is the white color palette, and then I'd paint over Susan's skin at 100%, and that would tell me where the yellows are in my subject's skin tones, and then I'd reduce those yellows and shift them more towards the reds. If we go all the way over to this side here, where our reds and purples are, we can slide it back until we've moved the hues and those yellows in her skin tones over to the reds. And then I will create another layer, which is another hue and saturation adjustment layer. Then I'd click red. I'd ramp this all the way to the top to get a visual representation of where the reds are in Susan's face. So, in any case, my point is that I'm looking at all of these logical steps, and I'm following a logical step or logical workflow to create consistent results. And this is what I dial in every single time. So from the top, I'm looking at my distracting objects. Then I'm looking at any potential distracting colors, and I'm getting rid of them. And then I'll move on to my subject. I'll look at any clothing issues with my subject's clothing, and then I will move on to my subject's skin tones. From that point, I will look at any issues that we might have with the hair. I'll make those adjustments, and then to finalize it, I will then do my little special dodge and burn process. Let me just flatten this image quickly here. This is some of the actions that I have available. I would go into my dodge and burn process over here, and this is where I would start with my lovely way of accentuating the highlights and shadows in my image. Let me just demonstrate that very quickly for you. So on my burn layer here, I'd grab my brush tool, and then I would accentuate the shadows of my subject. So let's reduce the flow here quickly to around about 10%. There we go. And then I would start building up the shadows that already exist in my subject. So around the arms, for example, or in the folds of the clothes over here, I would really go to town and really start etching out the shape and dimension of my subject. So let's just move out here. Look at how we've created that shape and dimension on Susan's face, just with a couple of brush strokes. So we could do the same with the hair, for example. I'd go into the dodge layers over here, and I would then create these beautiful highlights in the hair. And I would generally look across my image, creating this beautiful balance with my dodge and burn tools, and that would finesse the image. Let's review what we've got going on here, because these are logical steps that I continue to follow in each of the images that I edit. So when I open up my image inside of Photoshop, coming from Lightroom, I know that the basis of those images all start the same for that particular series of images. And then I'm going to look at the distracting objects. It might be some things in the background here that I need to get rid of. And then the petticoat, for example. And then I would evaluate my image in terms of colors that are distracting away from my subject or don't conform to the color harmony. And then I would move on to elements on my subject itself. Is the clothing right? Is the details right? Is the skin tones right? Is the hair right? And I dolly up my subject accordingly, and then I would tie it up and say, there we go, I've completed the edit, I'm happy with that. And I'd move on to the next image and create exactly the same flow every time. Now that's the key to creating that consistent workflow. So you can build your editing workflow the way you want. Maybe you don't want to look at distracting objects first or distracting colors first. Maybe you want to work with your subject. But through my experience and editing thousands and thousands of client images, I've built this process, and it works very much like the top-down nature of Lightroom. I'm working with the basics here. The basics are going to determine the starting point of my image inside of Photoshop. So I'm making sure that all of these things are aligned and I'm happy with them, because that's the basis of everything. And then I'm taking the image into Photoshop for those final steps, getting rid of those things. Some people like to do everything in Lightroom. I just happen to like using Lightroom and Photoshop in my process because they're interconnected, they tied in with one another. So for example, if we go back to Photoshop here and I close off this image, we'll just keep everything over there for now, and I say save, it's going to drop my image back into Lightroom with that edited result. So let's go back to Lightroom, and you'll see here, there's my starting point there, and this is the edited version in inverted commas. Okay, so we've got all of these little things going around here, but I just wanted you guys to have this little view into my workflow. So I'm making sure that what I do at camera level starts that consistency buzz, and then I'm bringing those images into Lightroom and I'm choosing them based on what I'm looking for in terms of those consistent values. I'm then making those edits to the images and synchronizing them across all the images in their respective sets. And that is where some of this consistency in the workflow comes in terms of the edit. And then, of course, like I said, we're then taking that image over into Photoshop and then working accordingly. So there you have it, folks. You've had this chance to discover what it is that I do in my portfolio to create those consistent results. If you've enjoyed this tutorial today, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to my channel. I've got way more to offer you guys, and I want to make it my mission to provide you guys with content that is actually helpful. So thank you very much for your awesome support, and we'll see you in the next session. Cheers for now.